Hello, everyone. This is the 149th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview English football fan Mr. Chris Bays as we discuss Liverpool's adventure in the 1996-97 Cup Winners' Cup. Mr. Bays has been on a podcast on a number of occasions discussing the Liverpool Football Club history. So, last time we summarized the Roy Evans era as Liverpool manager. This time we'll focus on this 1996-97 season. During our discussion, we might cover areas that we already discussed last time, but we'll focus more on the European matches this season, along with the season as a whole. So, Chris, welcome back.
Yeah, hi Shahan. Thanks for having me on again. Interested to talk about this season because it was a key season in sort of the Roy Evans era. So yeah, looking forward to talking about it. Mostly, like I said, perhaps there'll be parts of it that I don't enjoy talking about as much, but I'll try and do it with a smile on my face as usual. So yeah, good to be back.
Let's review from our previous conversation. What was the status of Liverpool in the English football landscape as we come to the summer of 1996?
Liverpool at this point, I think they were trying to sort of reassert their position really at like the summit of the English game. So an unprecedented sort of period of dominance, like we've talked about before, came to sort of quite an abrupt end really in the early 90s. And obviously like Manchester United had gone on to be like the dominant side in English football during the early Premiership era. Like we talked about previously when we talked about the Roy Evans reign as a whole, Liverpool had appointed Evans in a sort of, I think, an attempt to kind of reconnect with like the boot room ethos that had served the club like so well previously. And Evans had sort of begun to kind of establish a side that was really exciting in terms of like a blend of youth. So the core of the side, like Fowler, Jones, McManaman, Redknapp, had all essentially come through at Liverpool, blending that with experience in the form of like Barnes and Rush. So that side that he began to build evolved into the side that we're going to discuss now. And obviously, we'd added one or two kind of players to the ranks in terms of Stan Collymore being a British record transfer that had come in up front to replace Rush. The previous season to this one, 95-96, Liverpool had finished third, been runners-up in the FA Cup. Like we talked about last time, that season had kind of got away from us in the November, where we only took like 1 point from 4 games. And if you took that kind of month out of that particular season, we wouldn't have been far away really from the league. Obviously, Newcastle had been the runaway leaders that season and were eventually overhauled by Manchester United. But Liverpool had gone like 15 games unbeaten in the middle part of the season, which I think probably gave an optimism ahead of 96-97 that we could perhaps go one better.
So let's reintroduce Roy Evans and how he was viewed by the Liverpool faithful at this point.
He was obviously part of the furniture at Liverpool, so he'd come through the ranks as a player. He'd never quite made it as a first team regular at Liverpool. And I think he was encouraged to move into coaching at a relatively early age. And he then moved through the coaching ranks, as it were. So he'd been a key part of the fabled boot room, and he'd held a variety of different roles. The sort of reserve team manager, where I think he'd won the Central League a number of times, because obviously Liverpool's reserve side back then was very strong. Eventually, he'd moved into the managerial hot seat when Graham Souness left. And I think the club had been preparing for Souness's departure because they'd made Evans the assistant manager the season prior to that. So, like I said last time, we'd stabilised things really after the relative sort of disaster, really, of the Graham Souness era. And he was generally, like, I think at this point, very well regarded by Liverpool's fan base. However, sort of looking back, I think the 1996 Cup final defeat, the white suits and all that, like we talked about last time, that had rankled with some fans, so like namely like my dad's generation, really, where I think there was a bit of a disconnect between the current side and what like people have say like my dad's generation thought were Liverpool's ethos and values. But I think overall the majority of the fan base had a lot of faith in Evans at this point, particularly because of what he'd inherited after the Souness period.
Last time we touched up on this, but let's look at the transfer in the summer of 1996 again, where it was the first season of the Bosman ruling in
Mm.
effect, the post 1996 Euros, where there's a lot of excitement in the British game. As far as the arrivals, the main one was Patrick Berger, the Czech player from Borussia Dortmund in Germany, who had impressed during the 1996 Euros. And later, we have lesser known players in January, the Danish goalkeeper Jorgen Nilsson and the Norwegian defender Bjorn Kvarm.
Yeah.
And as far as the departures, we took some time last time to explain the impact of Ian Rush, who had now left to Leeds. And later in the season, John Scales would join Tottenham. Again, last time mentioned how other teams were spending money, but Liverpool were not spending as much.
I think, the signing of Berger was very exciting because, as you say, he'd been a key performer in the Czech Republic side that went all the way to the final in Euro 96. Liverpool had also been linked with his teammate, Karel Poborský, that summer, and he ended up signing for Man United. Again, when you sort of look back in the chapter in my mate Simon Hughes, his book, Men in White Suits, Evans talks about wanting to sort of bring in Jari Litmanen and Teddy Sheringham from Tottenham. But in the case of Sheringham, I think he was overruled by the board. They refused to sanction the move for Sheringham due to his age. And he obviously later also signed for Man United. So I think it sort of shows really that he wasn't maybe fully backed in the transfer market.
And one thing
That,
I want to add when you mentioned Poborski, in that transfer window, like we said, I mean, Liverpool brought in Patrick Berger. In
yeah,
contrast, Manchester United signed Karel Poborski. They
yeah,
brought in Jordi Cruyff.
yeah,
They brought in Ole Gunnar Solskjaer and Ronnie Johnson
Johnson,
and
yeah,
Raymond van der Gaal as a
yeah,
backup goalkeeper.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm sure I'm forgetting other people, but it just shows the contrast that
yeah.
teams were spending while I think Liverpool maybe were reluctant to spend that kind of a money at this point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was going to come on to sort of say that about Man United, about how they added several players during that window. That was to a side that obviously had won the double the previous year, whereas Liverpool only signed Berger. That was perhaps an issue. Also, I think a lot of the other teams in the Premiership were adding imports, some of whom did well, some of whom didn't do so well. But I think also what it highlights, like what you talk about there with United, they were kind of developing more of a squad-based system, whereas I think Liverpool only really truly began to grasp the concept of sort of squad rotation when Gerard Houllier became the manager. And also the other thing to say, I think Roy Evans's focus seemingly all of those names that we've mentioned there, they're all attacking players, aren't they? So it was perhaps the other end of the pitch where reinforcements were needed. And I think that became evident as this season went on, as we'll come on to talk about.
This would be the first season where Liverpool would unveil their Reebok shirts,
Yeah,
breaking
much on
away from
sport in there.
Adidas. Of course, the away kit would be the white shirts and black shorts.
The Akru kit, it was almost ironic that, wasn't it? Because they got panned for wearing the white suits in the final, and then they had a kit
Yeah, I didn't
that.
even think about that. Yeah.
So yeah, it's funny.
Let's look at the backbone of this Liverpool squad for this 1996-97.
David James had established himself as Liverpool's number one goalkeeper by this point, and I think it's fair to say, even at this stage, he was battling with the Calamity James kind of nickname and reputation. Evans had sort of set up the side to play with a 3-5-2 like formation. So Mark Wright had sort of re-established himself as the mainstay in defence, and alongside him, there was a number of options that we had. We brought in like Phil Babb and John Scales for quite big fees, and they tended to sort of be in and around the first team picture, as did Neil Ruddock, who was a relatively popular player with the crowd at that time. But during 95, 96, he'd kind of been in and out of the side, and he obviously didn't play in the FA Cup final. So perhaps his role was becoming marginalised a little bit at this point. We also had Steve Harkness, who'd played a lot during the 95-96 season, had sadly got injured towards the end of that campaign. And Dominic Matteo, I think, broke through this season, particularly towards the start of the year. Matteo was very impressive. I think he was sort of being described, perhaps prematurely, as like a new Alan Hansen, like his kind of comfort on the ball and what have you. I think that's a problem with Liverpool generally, really, that like when a young player comes through, a lot of the time they're described to a legend in comparison. Sometimes they don't necessarily live up to that. But Matteo did look the part when he broke through. Like say, we played with this wing-back system, so Jason McAteer had come in from Bolton and he'd established himself down the right. The previous season, Rob Jones had played left wing back for a lot of the campaign, but he was injured for much of this season. And so Stig Inge Bjornaby came back into the side and he had a really good season. In midfield, John Barnes was still the captain and sort of the dictating force. Alongside him, you normally had Jamie Redknapp or Michael Thomas. McManaman had a key role in Liverpool's team, obviously kind of linking midfield and attack. And then up front, we had Fowler, Collymore, and or Berger. So there's a lot of firepower in the team. On paper, I think we look a really well-balanced side going into the season. I think, obviously, and you sort of probably kind of heard this last time and just now again, my sort of concerns always around this time were defensively. I think that was, as the season progressed, it proved the point that we probably weren't as strong as we needed to be at the back.
Liverpool had finished fourth in 1994-95 and they had finished third in the previous season. So I imagine many expected for Liverpool to be serious title challengers this time around.
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone sort of at this point, and we talked about this, didn't we, last time, that it was still within quite recent memory that Liverpool had won the league at this point, even though it's sort of 6 or 7 years now since Liverpool won the 89-90 First Division title. And it seemed like a lifetime at that time since we'd last won the league. But yeah, I think we would have felt that this became a bit of a running joke, didn't it? That this could be our year. But we were well placed going into this season. I think ourselves and Manchester United would have been the two side with genuine aspirations of winning the league. Maybe Newcastle.
Liverpool were to compete in the Cup Winners' Cup after Manchester United had won the double in the previous season. What were the expectations of Liverpool regarding this competition?
Yeah, the Cup Winners' Cup, Liverpool have a bit of a funny history with that, really. It's kind of very much the one that got away. Like, so the prize Liverpool never won. It was the first final that Liverpool reached in European competition. So they lost to Borussia Dortmund, I think, in 1966 in the final. And also Liverpool's record win in European competition also came in the Cup Winners' Cup against the Norwegian sides. We hadn't really been in the competition that many times previously because obviously during Liverpool's period of dominance, they tended to either be in the UEFA Cup, which they won a couple of times in the 70s, or the Champions Cup. We had one foray in the Cup Winners' Cup that I can remember in 92, 93, but that didn't really last very long. We lost to Spartak Moscow. I think it would have been exciting to be in this competition. I think a lot of people thought that we had a genuine shot of winning it, really, even though we had kind of crept into this competition through the back door, as it were, with United winning the double the previous season.
Let's take a look at this competition. Liverpool in the first round were paired against Finnish side Mipa. The first leg was at Finland at Anjalankoski. On September 12th, Liverpool won this match 1-0 with a Björnaby strike in the 61st minute. On September 26th at Anfield, Liverpool defeated Mipa 3-1. Liverpool were always expected to defeat this side. It was an easy first round for Liverpool. For this second match at Anfield, Liverpool won with goals through Berger, Collymore, and Barnes. And Mipa replied through Keskitalo.
MIPA 47, I remember they being known as. Like, it does evoke interesting memories when you look back, because there are obviously some sides when you look back who have sort of sustained their presence at sort of, the top level of football, and then there are these sort of anomaly teams who, like Liverpool or whoever you follow, kind of maybe follow once, or you see them play them once or twice. But yeah, I can remember this being quite a comfortable win. Yeah, Bjornaby scored in the first leg. As I say, he'd re-established himself in the side this year after being absent for much of the 95-96 season. And he became a bit more of a weapon in Liverpool's arsenal. Like, he had good crossing from the left, particularly from deep positions, which I think he got quite a number of assists this season. Yeah, fairly comfortable win in the end, probably as expected. And we were then through to the next round where we faced Sion from Switzerland, I think.
The second round, it's against the Suicide Sion. The first leg was at Sion on October 17th. For this match, Sion would take the lead through Christophe Bonvin in the 11th minute. However, Robbie Fowler would reply in the 24th minute, and in the second half, in the 60th minute, John Barnes would score the winner. There would be plenty of goals in the second leg at Anfield, on October 31st. Liverpool wins this match 6-3 after falling behind 2-0. Frederic Chassot scored in the 19th minute, and again Christophe Bonvin scored in the 23rd minute before Liverpool came back. McManaman pulled the goal back in the 28th minute. Björnaby tied the match with a free kick in the 54th minute. But then Sion scored another goal in the 64th minute. But Liverpool quickly tied the match when John Barnes knocked in Berger's cross on the left side just a minute later. At this point, Liverpool were through. They would score 3 more goals. The fourth one was scored by Robbie Fowler in the 71st minute when McManaman picked up an erroneous pass and went to the left side and crossed for Fowler. A minute later, McManaman just poked the pass through into the box for Fowler. And in the 90th minute, John Barnes sent a long cross upfield, and Patrick Berger scored the 6th. Liverpool were through to the quarterfinals.
Yeah, they kind of made hard work of it, though, didn't they? I think this is a tie kind of that sums up Liverpool under Roy Evans to a degree, because, like you say, we won the first game 2-1. So you're thinking that's set up for like an easy night's work back at Anfield. But that lack of perhaps game management and the defensive frailties that we've discussed previously sort of came to the fore again. Eventually, we win 6-3 and 8-4 on aggregate, and everything is happy and everyone's happy. it was a lot harder perhaps than it needed to be. I can vividly remember going to this game, and I remember like the Swiss fans with the cowbells being like very excited, obviously, when they sort of raced into a lead. And obviously that seemed to like rouse Liverpool into action. And in the second half, we scored quite a few goals, like you say, and we went through with a bit of a flourish in the end. But I suppose, like looking back, you can sort of see that it was quite easy for teams to sort of get at Liverpool. It sort of suggests really that when they encounter maybe more formidable opposition than Sion, they'd probably struggle. And I think that's what we sort of foresaw through that game, really.
As the season reaches midpoint, Liverpool were challenging for the title with Manchester United
Yeah,
and were in the quarterfinals of the Cup Winners' Cup. However, they were eliminated from both domestic cup competitions by January.
yeah.
So, what was the outlook at this point?
Yeah, I looked back over this season, obviously in prep for this, and can remember like we led the league, didn't we, at Christmas by I think 5 points, I think, or the turn of the year. So that looked pretty good at that point. But when sort of cast more of an eye back over the campaign, we were pretty inconsistent throughout this season. So we never really strung a long unbeaten run like we'd done the previous season together. It was always a bit of a stop-start campaign. So there was some pretty like chasing and defeats in even the first part of the season. So we got stuffed by Blackburn, I can remember, on a Sunday, 3-0. And I think Blackburn had a particularly bad start to the season. So that was a blow. Then we lost at home to Sheffield Wednesday. But what sort of seemingly happened in the first part of the season, whenever we'd have a setback, we'd kind of come back, go on a run of wins or undefeated games, and everyone would think, oh, well, we're going to do well this season. But I think perhaps it was like a little bit of a false impression that was given. The domestic cup games, the defeats were both very disappointing. So in the League Cup, we'd beaten Arsenal en route to the quarters where we faced Middlesbrough. David James again just basically gives one of the goals to Middlesbrough. Then they scored again soon after, so we were two down and we pulled one back from McManaman, but we'd gone out. We lost 2-1 in quite a disappointing defeat, but quite a poor record at Middlesbrough during this period, I think. And then the FA Cup game against Chelsea, probably see a slightly pained expression on my face. We were like 2-0 up at half time and so comfortable. And then basically just got bullied in the second half. We lost 4-2. Chelsea inspired by Mark Hughes and Luca Vialli. And yeah, that was another massive blow. And I think for me, that was a point where alarm bells began to ring because there was this pattern of just defensive aberrations, David James having brain lapses seemingly in goal. We never seemed capable of going on like a long enough unbeaten run to feel comfortable, even though we were at the top of the league. I think comparing this season to the previous one, we'd obviously had that nightmare November, but we'd then strung, I think, 15 matches unbeaten in the turn of the year. And we never did that this season. We never went on a run of more than sort of 6 or 7 games where we didn't lose. So I think even though we were always in and around the top, I think it perhaps gave a slightly false impression of our capabilities, really.
Another much talked about event this season was the incident with Robbie Fowler against, I think it was Arsenal, where
Yeah,
a penalty kick is awarded for a foul on him, but then he tells a referee that he was not fouled and is
yeah.
called off. And I remember he received a lot of praise for being honest and not taking a cheap penalty kick.
Yeah, I mean, Fowler at this point, he was still, although his goals to games return this season perhaps wasn't quite as impressive as the previous two, he was still on fire at this point in time. It probably reflects really like sort of how strong England were in the attacking positions at that time because he didn't really get the international recognition I think that his goals probably deserved because obviously England had Shearing and Sheringham and maybe Ferdinand as well. So like Ian Wright, there was a lot of good English strikers around at this time, but Robbie Fowler was certainly up there with any of them at this point in time.
We come to the spring quarterfinals round. Liverpool face Norwegian side Brann of Bergen, which again would have been looked upon as a team that should not be a problem for Liverpool.
Hmm.
The first leg on March 6th is at Bergen. Liverpool would take the lead in the 10th minute. Neil Ruddock sends a long cross the left side on the Liverpool half, and Björnaby immediately heads it across
Yeah,
to Robbie Fowler, who side foots it, and the ball goes over the head of his defender, and he goes around and from a narrow
yeah,
angle shoots in and gives Liverpool the lead. So
yeah.
it was a very beautiful goal.
I remember trying very much to impersonate this, I think, at the time in the school playground. Because, yeah, as you say, technically it's a fantastic goal, isn't it? He flicks it over the defender's head, catches it. It reminded me a little bit of the Gascoigne goal in Euro
Oh,
96, a
yes.
little bit. But I suppose that sort of tells you the fact that I'm comparing Fowler there to a player like Gaza, again, technically brilliant. It sort of shows the level he was at, really. He scored a lot of goals that were just the result of sort of his own vision or his own natural finishing ability, really. This probably being one of his best goals. Yeah, Neil Ruddock plays a really nice ball, doesn't he, as you say, in the build up to that. He then gets turned inside out for Brambergen's equaliser,
Oh,
which
yes.
probably,
In the 48th minute by Geir Hazund. Yes.
yeah, probably shows the two contrasting sides of Neil Ruddock's game, really, because he did have a lovely left foot, but he was again another player, I think, who was prone to the odd defensive aberration. But yeah, I think that was like a 1-1 draw in the first leg, which set it up nicely for the second leg at Anfield.
I want to point out that in the ranks of Brand, the one familiar face was Tor Andre
Poor
Flo,
Andre, yeah.
who would later join Chelsea.
He was supposed to join Everton, actually, I remember. And I don't know if you're aware of this, Shahan, but that was part of the reason, apparently, why Joe Royle resigned as Everton's manager because they had a deal in place for Flo, which the club then reneged on. And obviously, Chelsea nipped in and got him. But yeah, he was a very well regarded prospect, wasn't he, around this time? And he obviously went on to be a good player in the Premiership as well.
The second leg is at Anfield on March 20th. For this match, in the 26th minute, Robbie Fowler is fouled in a box and he scores from a penalty kick. In the 60th minute, Stan Collymore scores a beautiful goal. He receives the ball near the middle of the field and he just goes on a solo run to score the second. And for the third one in the 77th minute, Bjornaby crossed from the left side and Fowler knocked it in. Of course, the main image of this match is when Robbie Fowler, as a sign of protest, he under his shirt he had, as homage to the Dockers, he had a DK sign, the
It was
logo.
like, yeah, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I had actually forgotten about that until you mentioned that. But yeah, that was a big thing because obviously there was the Dockers dispute still going on during this period. Yeah, Fowler obviously unveiled the T-shirt that I think it was the Calvin Klein logo, wasn't it? That it was sort of.
Was he fined for that? I don't remember.
Yeah, I think he
Yeah.
was, yeah, but I think it was quite a evocative image, wasn't it? An iconic image, really. And also probably something that showed how, despite the fact that footballers were like earning kind of unprecedented riches, a local lad like Fowler still had retained probably an empathy with the fans and with kind of the Dockers at that point. There's also an interesting story that's probably less well known that Stig Inge Bjornaby went to meet some of the Dockers picketing at the time, and he made a big donation, I think, to their campaign. So yeah, I think Fowler obviously got the headlines because of what he did and perhaps his status. But yeah, I think some of the Dockers speak very positively about Bjornaby and kind of the fact that he went and spent some time with them. So yeah, it was, as I say, an iconic image. But like in terms of the game, Liverpool were quite comfortable in the end in that one. They'd then gone through to the semi-finals where we faced Paris Saint-Germain famously.
So for the semifinals, Liverpool face French side Paris Saint-Germain. Some of the familiar names include goalkeeper Bernard Lama, who would later have a stint with West Ham. You have the Brazilian Leonardo Rai, another Brazilian, the
Yeah,
captain of the team, brother of Socrates, managed by Brazilian Ricardo Gomes. Top French team at this point.
yeah,
The first leg on April 10th is at Paris at Parc des Princes. You would see again some of the worst of David James. In the 12th minute, David James punched out a cross from the right side. Benoit Coe took a shot that was again parried by James. Coe took the rebound and crossed from the left side for Leonardo to score the first goal. In the 43rd minute, Jerome Leroy crossed from the right side. This was handled by James, and he probably should have had saved it, but he diverted it to the far post, and it was headed back. Coe struck it in. The third goal would be in the 84th minute when Puget crossed from the right side and Jerome Leroy knocked it in. A heavy deficit going back to Anfield on April 24th at Anfield. Liverpool pulled the goal back quickly. On the 12th minute, Stan Collymore would win the ball and give it to Fowler, who volleyed from a somewhat narrow angle. Going back to the first leg, I think, did John Bars take a lot of flack for the first leg? Because I think that's when
yeah,
his career was
yeah,
more or less over with Liverpool, it seems like,
yeah.
right?
He got dropped, didn't he, for the second game?
Right, right.
We're gonna probably come on to talk about another match, I think,
Of course, yeah,
sort of
sandwich in
came, yeah,
between, yeah.
in between. But the first leg, just a very chastening defeat, another one during this season where it was hard to sort of watch because part of Liverpool's fallibility this season, a lot of it was self-inflicted. A large proportion of that was down to the goalkeeper, really. David James, very capable goalkeeper on his day, capable of remarkable saves, fantastic athleticism, but also consistently throughout his Liverpool career, prone to just making these kind of hugely costly mistakes where he'd come for crosses that he never really should have come for. And yeah, that first game, like watching the goals back, still makes me squirm now. Like, but yeah, we got battered basically in that first game, completely overran in midfield. As you say, Barnes was possibly scapegoated for that. And we brought Michael Thomas on in the second half to try and shore things up. It looked as though it had worked to a degree and we were going to take it back at 2-0. But then PSG added another late on. It suddenly then looked completely impossible task back at Anfield. But Liverpool had a really good go in the second leg. And as you say, Barnes was dropped. I'm not sure if he played again. I'd have to look back over the team sheet, but I certainly remember he was dropped for the second leg. Stan Collymore had an outstanding game against PSG in the second leg. Really ran Bruno and Gotti, the defender, ragged. And as you say, Fowler scored early, and then Mark Wright added one with about 10 minutes to go.
Bjornabe took a corner kick in the 80th minute from the right side, and Mark Wright headed in.
Mark
But
Wright was the captain for the
yes,
evening in the absence of Barnes. And yeah, we had chances, but we had a couple of chances in the first leg as well. Like Fowler and McManaman had chances, but defensively we were all over the place really in that first leg. We just ultimately had too much to do in the second leg. And it was frustrating because in the second game, we'd really taken PSG apart, shown what we were capable of on our day. But in the first leg, we also showed what we were capable of on our day, which was much less attractive, shall we say. So, yeah, again, like a slight microcosm of the Evans era, them two games, really, the defensive aberrations, but attacking brilliance as well. Yeah, ultimately, we went out 3-2 on aggregate.
a key loss occurred in the league in between these Paris Saint-Germain matches. On April 19th at home, Liverpool lost to Manchester United 3-1. Was this really the reference point where the wheels came off as far as the season?
It was reported that way, wasn't it? And ultimately, you'd have to say yes, because like it was kind of a title decider, really. And obviously, we lost 3-1. But the damage had already been done before this because United lost unexpectedly at home to Derby in a game that's maybe famous for their Paulo One-Shot made his debut for Derby and scored a world class goal. One of my best mates is a Derby fan, so that's why I have a memory of that. But we then lost the day after to Coventry at home in a game, obviously, we would have been expected to win again. Coventry had a good record against Liverpool though, during this period. We did tend to struggle against some of the smaller clubs, shall we say, or the lesser lights. Not wanting to be disrespectful to Coventry, but they caused us a lot of problems under Evans. But this game against Coventry was one where we completely dominated and should have won comfortably, but then we imploded because, again, David James, particularly culpable, set pieces, Gary McAllister, two corners, and we've lost the game 2-1 that we should have won at a canter. If we had won that game, we would have been top of the table ahead of playing United. But suddenly we're behind, and that game then takes on a far greater magnitude and importance. And Liverpool wilted under the pressure again. Having watched, it took me years actually to summon the courage maybe to watch that game back again. And it was only during the first COVID lockdown that I actually watched that game back. Liverpool, again, they're just victims of their own downfall, really. Like, we crumble under pressure. David James basically has a hand in, I think, all United, certainly two of them. He's particularly culpable. They all come from crosses, and obviously that was a weak point that sides could play upon. But again, we had chances in that game. We got back at 1-1. We had opportunities, but we lost 3-1. And I think the thing that hurt most as a fan at that time was the United didn't even have to play that well to win the game 3-1. And probably as a whole during the season as well, they didn't play that well to win the league either. You know, I think they won it with 75 points, which is the,
Yeah, it
you know,
felt like they won by default this season.
yeah, yeah. Liverpool had this spluttering kind of nature that, like, you know, they'd win a few games, then they'd throw in kind of a really poor performance, and they just never looked comfortable despite being in and around or at the top of the league for much of the season. So, like you say, it's sort of seen as the turning point, isn't it? I think in the Evans regime that they had this fantastic opportunity to win the title and they blew it really. And I think, as I say, that's the bit that hurts as a fan, that it was our own kind of ineptitude that sort of cost us really. So yeah, that period of results was kind of a turning point, I think, for Evans really.
Liverpool in the Cup Winners' Cup, the only time they really faced a top team was in the semifinals against
Yeah.
Paris Saint-Germain. Losing 3-0 was almost unprecedented for Liverpool in Europe.
Mm.
How do you look at their European adventure on balance?
I think adventure is a good word for that season because there were some really exciting games that I would see on, like I say, probably illustrates Evans and Liverpool under Evans, because we ended up getting drawn into this sort of epic end-to-end game when we should have really been comfortable winners. And I think that, and then the first leg against PSG sort of speaks to a real weakness that we had, that we tried to probably outscore teams rather than being defensively solid. And obviously, a contemporary side of this era, Newcastle, were a little bit similar under Kevin Keegan. Whereas the side that obviously went on to dominate English football, Manchester United, were capable of putting teams to the sword, but they were also defensively solid as well. And I think that was the real weakness under Evans, and a weakness of this European campaign, really, that like, oh, it doesn't matter if we concede three because we'll score six. Yeah, well, you can do that against Sion, but PSG with some of the world class players, they are a different proposition, aren't they?
For the league title, Liverpool were challenging with Manchester United. However, when it came to the finish line, Newcastle and Arsenal just finished ahead of them, I believe, on goal difference.
Goal difference,
Yeah.
yeah.
And the Liverpool finished fourth, and saying that they finished fourth in a two-horse race. This end of the season was very depressing and negative for
Yeah.
Liverpool fans all over.
Yeah, I mean, that line, fourth in a two-horse race, is sort of a line that became, like, trotted out by Manchester United fans and then adopted by the media. There was obviously already a lot of sort of reportage around like the Spice Boys, like the previous season, the suits and all that in the FA Cup final. The line itself, whilst it's a good one, it's probably also recycling something that actually happened in the 80s, where Man United were the side that finished fourth in 85, 86 after being well ahead after 10 games, and sort of the press were sort of declaring them as champions. And obviously, it was Liverpool and Everton that came back at that point, and Liverpool won the double that season. So these things have a habit of repeating themselves. And obviously, United were sort of enjoying the revenge of this era after like their long barren run where they didn't win the league for many seasons. But I do think this year it represents kind of like a real disappointment for Liverpool fans, and probably a key turning point really under Evans, because like I say, and like we talked about before, Liverpool threw this away themselves. They kind of crumbled under the pressure really. It was probably a turning point under Evans, because I don't think we were ever as close again. We had a relatively good season the season after, finished third, I think. And if you look at Roy Evans's record, it now he probably would have been qualifying for the Champions League year in, year out. But obviously, it was a different landscape back then. We were never as close again after this season. So I think it's very much a turning point in his managerial tenure.
Who were the scapegoats for this end of the season implosion as far as the players?
Yeah, John Barnes, kind of like we talked about before, he sort of seemed to be scapegoated. And I can remember in that game against United, I think he was substituted after scoring. earlier in the game. He was substituted, I think, as we were sort of chasing the match. And I can remember a number of people sort of sat around me, kind of almost being slightly glad that he was being substituted or saying things like, oh, he's past his sell by date, he's past it now. And I think for me, Barnes was kind of a bit unfairly scapegoated because, like we talked about on the last episode, a lot of the time at this era, people were saying, oh, Liverpool need a Paul Ince type figure. Liverpool needs to sign Paul Ince. And then they did sign Paul Ince. And we changed formation and reverted to 4-4-2. And I think we lost something really as a result of that. Now, Barnes obviously was kind of advancing in years, but one thing that I always vividly remember about John Barnes, and even when you watch the highlights from this season back, he dictated the play. He sort of reverted to this new holding role, and he very rarely gave the ball away. So he was kind of, I think, unfairly scapegoated, and the reversion to this more kind of traditional 4-4-2 and having a combative player like Ince in there. I think Liverpool lost out really through changing that way. Now, they might have needed to change Barnes. They might have needed to replace Barnes, but maybe a more like for like replacement would have been better. But that's just maybe hindsight on my part. And obviously, loving John Barnes from like his previous successes as well, possibly blinded me a little bit, but I think he was unfairly scapegoated. The person who also got scapegoated fairly and probably should have been replaced after this season was David James and possibly a number of the defenders as well. Ruddock has a number of games where he's not up to it this season. I think that was the area of the pitch where we needed to make changes because they kept reoccurring, like kind of throughout the campaign. But yeah, David James remained at Liverpool for longer, didn't he? And yeah, I think he was kind of scapegoated, but probably fairly so, in my opinion.
John Barnes would be offloaded to Newcastle in the following season.
Yeah, yeah, sad because, like I say, like he obviously had that injury, his Achilles injury, that robbed him of the pace that he'd had when he was that like dynamic winger. But he'd reinvented himself as kind of this holding midfielder who dictated the tempo and the play. So I've still got fond memories of Barnes up until the end of this season, where he was kind of a key figure. But yeah, he was moved on to Newcastle the following season, and that was the end of his career at Liverpool. Yeah,
Michael Owen makes a cameo at the end of this season. Was he known to Liverpool football connoisseurs at this point?
yeah. I mean, I can remember seeing Owen play a number of times this season in reserve games because the reserves used to play at Anfield still at this time, and sometimes, particularly during like an international break, I'd go to like a reserve game. And Owen, I can remember playing alongside Collymore a few times when he was in
Sorry,
and out
just
of
out
the
of
side.
curiosity, how many people would go to reserve matches? Do you remember?
Not maybe
Not
a
many.
thousand.
Okay.
Like so you'd go into Anfield and there'd be essentially three stands empty and maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people in the main stand. I can remember a reserve game this season where we played Manchester United and Manchester United's reserves won. I think it was 3-0 or 3-1. Scholes played for United and was dominant. And Andy Cole had both his legs broken by Neil Ruddock in that game. Now, there was a larger crowd at that game, but obviously that would have been due to probably the presence of a number of first team players on both sides and also the Liverpool United rivalry. But yeah, not that many people would go. But yeah, Owen, I can remember seeing him play in the reserves. He'd been a key player in the youth side that had won the Youth Cup in 95, 96, alongside the likes of Carragher and David Thompson. And all three of them began to emerge in the first team picture around this
Could you
point.
tell at this point, watching him, that he
Yeah,
was a special
yeah,
talent?
yeah, definitely. And in the reserve games that I can remember, like you could tell that as well. It was his pace, wasn't it, when he first came into the fold? He really had like this blinding pace that he later lost really after the hamstring injuries, and he had to change his game, which he did successfully, and he was still a top striker for many years. But yeah, when he first came into the scene, yeah, I think you'd never seen anything like it in terms of the pace that he had. Obviously, he had real coolness in terms of his finishing as well. So yeah, his kind of breakthrough was a real sort of shining light for the future. And it probably helped Roy Evans to sort of make the decision to offload Collymore as well, because they knew they had this talent coming through. And obviously, we had Fowler. We then added Riedler the following season. So I think Owen's kind of emergence probably helped make that decision about Collymore, because despite the fact that he had a reasonable goals to games ratio, he never truly settled at Liverpool. And I think particularly this season, there were a lot of kind of periods where he was in and out of the side, and there were off the field issues, shall we say. So yeah, Owen was in and around the first team picture as this season developed. He scored, didn't he, when he came into the side against Wimbledon, and then I think he played in the final game at Sheffield Wednesday as well. And yeah, it was the following year that he really broke through. But yeah, people were well aware of him. As I say, the likes of Carragher and Thompson as well. Like Steven Gerrard was the same age as Michael Owen, wasn't he? But I think it took him a good number of years to break through, even though he was kind of a name that people were aware of as well.
We already mentioned this before, but in retrospect, do you think Evans should have spent more in the offseason like most other teams?
I think he should have added maybe more options to the squad. I think it's quite easy to sort of say in hindsight, like, yeah, he should have done. But obviously, he'd built this team that was dynamic and had a lot of flair, but probably lacked solidity. But then when they added the solidity in the form of Ince, they maybe lost a little bit of what made them what they were. So I think it's clear when you read the chapter in Simon Hughes's book that Roy Evans feels that perhaps he wasn't backed by the board at certain points. But I think also, in fairness, he showed too much loyalty to certain players. And by the end of this season, it's clear looking back that some need to be replaced. And in the form of James, they weren't replaced, and they kind of continued to play and continue to be a problem. I think that's ultimately why Evans failed. He didn't perhaps show the ruthlessness that he had done in the early part of his tenure, where he got rid of the likes of Grobbelaar, Nicol, Whelan, Don Hutchison, who was a bit of a problem off the field, like Julian Dix. Like he got rid of players with a ruthlessness in the early part of his tenure. As his tenure wore on, he perhaps gave too many chances to certain players who let him down time and again, really. So yeah, I think we probably should have kind of added a few more faces ahead of this season. Like I said before, we were probably never as close again under Evans, but he did add a number of new faces in the following campaign, but it was always the defence that was the issue, and we never really managed to kind of find a dominant kind of centre half to shore things up, really, despite being linked with multiple players. So yeah, he probably should have addressed that in the transfer market, I think.
In closing, for Liverpool historians, is this season often cited as a missed opportunity, not only for European glory, but for the league title? or maybe after 20 some odd years, it's seldom discussed?
Yeah, I think it's seen as a missed opportunity by people like me who tend to like look back and are very sort of fond of retro football and obviously very fond of Roy Evans as well, because whilst ultimately he will probably be regarded as a little bit of a nearly man, the side that he produced played some really fantastic football and probably should have been rewarded maybe with more trophies. Also, again, like a bit of a football nerd like myself is probably gutted that we never actually won the European Cup Winners' Cup. And then also we would have, if we'd have beaten PSG, faced Barcelona with Ronaldo and Bobby Robson was the manager. So that would have been quite a fascinating matchup as well. So yeah, I mean, I think the Evans period as a whole tends to be focused on a lot of the kind of the negative sort of reportage around the Spice Boys, and this season probably adds value to that in the sense that Liverpool were like in a position where they could and probably should have won the league this season, but they kind of threw it away themselves. And I think that this season is where the mainstream media start to sort of really turn up the heat on Roy Evans, begin to question if he's going to recapture the league and all of that. And they begin to question the mentality of the Spice Boys narrative, and that kind of gathers momentum. So, yeah, I think we were never as close again under Evans. And I think a number of the players, when you read interviews or kind of reflections that they have, they look back on this season with that same sense of like dejection. They know that this was a real missed opportunity. I think I've read Mark Wright talked about that we were the best team on our day and we should have done more this particular season. Jason McAteer, I think these players knew and know now that they kind of threw it away, and this season was the one that really they imploded and were victims of their own implosion. I think it will be regarded as a bit of a missed opportunity and a turning point really for Roy Evans, because I think it was where questions about his future began to gather momentum really after this season. We know that he was then replaced soon after, really, or like after another season and a bit. So yeah, a missed opportunity.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Chris, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Yeah, thank you. Like I say, I think I managed to put a smiling face on despite the pain at the end of that season. So thanks again, Shahan. Been great to talk to you today.
Thank you.